I'm going to speak first. Yes.
So I will let him,
Excellent.
give it on to you.
Thank you. Thank you all for showing up here this lovely morning, very early in the morning. So I will be going over due diligence, and my brother Philip will be going over property management. So I'm the older brother, so I took acquisition and rehab and gave my younger brother property management, which is the way to do it. On Tuesday, I talked about our general strategy, why I thought buy and hold was so powerful. It's the ideal method: income, depreciation, so you don't pay taxes, or at least not as much, equity buildup over time, appreciation, and the ability to use leverage. And of course, the reason that leverage is so powerful is because, so you buy a property, like in this case, you buy it for $80,000, its value is $100,000, you get a 75% loan, so it's $60,000. It goes up 5%. If it went up, well, let's just say it goes up 5%, you actually make 20% on your money because you have a 75% loan. So if it goes up $5,000, you go $5,000 on your $20,000 investment because you have a $75,000 loan. That's a 25% return, actually. The risk, of course, with that is that if it goes down, you lose 25%. But if you have an equity margin, you buy with 20% equity in the property to start with, all of a sudden you're insulated from that risk. If it goes down 10%, so be it. You still have 10% equity if you get, or even more. But the problem is a lot of real estate investors, especially new investors, but plenty of seasoned investors, think they're getting an equity margin, but aren't. We've had deals in the past where we thought this is an A deal or this is a B plus deal, and all of a sudden realized, no, this is a D deal. This is maybe even one of our worst deals. We've had deals that we thought were some of our best turn into some of our worst, and it almost always had to do with screwing up the due diligence part. And so due diligence this is our little circle, right, for the BRRRR strategy: buy, rehab, refinance, repeat. Due diligence is one of the key aspects in buying, and it affects every single aspect of the acquisition. We'll call it the BRRRR circle. I guess we're going to coin that now. And the reason is because if you miss something, your rehab's going to go over budget, your rent's not going to be there, you're not going to be able to get refinance out as much as you thought because it won't appraise where you want it to, or you can't sell it as much for what you want. So there's a good book I recommend reading called the Checklist Manifesto. It goes over all sorts of studies and looks into different industries. It looks into the medical field, business, government, everything. And it's found that just having a checklist is extremely, extremely effective. It really increases people's productivity and reduces mistakes multiple times over. And so with due diligence, this is all the more important. And even if you've done it 1,000 times, not having this checklist to go through, things get missed, things get skipped. A lot of this, due diligence is not the most fun, entertaining thing that there is. It's rather dull. So having that checklist to go through is extremely important because while this is not the most fun part of real estate, it is possibly the most important. So the first part is the pre-offer due diligence. This is effectively your analysis, and that consists of analyzing the area, the value, and the financial estimate, and the rehab estimate. And then once you get under contract, we have the post-acceptance due diligence. And this consists of the physical due diligence, the financial due diligence, which is predominantly with apartments, commercial properties, and the rest, but is still a little bit with single-family houses and condos and the like. Legal due diligence and inspections. Then retrading, which is basically renegotiating the price if necessary, if it's called for. And finally, making your final decision. Are you going to go through with it, or are you going to walk away? So we're going to start with the area analysis. First thing with the area analysis is just asking experts or people who know who people have been doing this. So the best place to start is really in this group, in Mary. Asking other investors, what do you think of this area? Have you had success in this area? Is this a hard area to rent in? Is it a hard area to sell in? You can go onto Bigger Pockets or other real estate websites and just go. They have all sorts of local forums. You can just ask about this particular spot. With regards to Kansas City, there's one helpful forum thread that I consistently bring out, which is just a list of every zip code in Kansas City and whether they think it's a good area to invest in or not for rentals. Property managers and contractors are other good people, but pretty much anyone in real estate and the like. I highly recommend viewing the area, driving around, not just especially for out-of-staters, not just looking at Google Earth. I'll get to that in a second. But also drive around at night too. If in rougher areas, that will become very apparent. And ask the people who live there, like, is this a nice place to live? Are there crime issues? How do you like it? They have a better experience in that area than just about anybody else you're going to meet. Actually, they literally have a better experience in that area, or more experience in that area than anybody else. So it's highly recommended, worth asking them. In fact, it reminds me of a fourplex that a friend of ours bought, and he did not do this beforehand, and then he was selling it because it didn't turn out very well, and he had it under contract, and the day before it was supposed to close, the buyer comes to the property and runs into the neighbor and says, and just starts up a conversation, how do you like living here? And it's like, well, other than the drug dealers and prostitutes, I guess it's okay. That property fell out of contract the very next day. So there are a lot of free websites. I'll get into them more specifically in a second. There are also some paid services and various reports that you can get on the city on the whole. So one of the things I mentioned, especially if you're buying out of state, which isn't so relevant here because there's not really a reason to buy out of state if you live in Kansas City, but Google Earth it always makes things look nicer than they actually are. So that's one of the reasons I highly recommend going there. Just smelling the smells, the sights, the movement really kind of brings it to life. This is Linwood and Prospect, which is one of the rougher areas in town, and yet it looks just fine in a still frame. In fact, actually at this area, the area has improved, but this was this intersection in this movie, this was early 80s, post-apocalypse, post-nuclear apocalypse was filmed at Linwood and Prospect. So it's not, not exactly the best area, but Google Earth can make it look a lot nicer than it actually is. So the first part with free websites, and really anyone who's just getting started in real estate can really get everything they need out of free websites. The best one is citydata.org. And this one, my favorite part about it is the map feature, which actually goes down to the block group. So with regards to, if you're looking at a zip code, it can be somewhat deceiving. For example, our office is in zip code 64131, and this splits right between Waldo and Southtown. And Southtown, Waldo is a higher end area with lower crime than Southtown, but if you look at it 64131 on the whole, then it looks like you're getting a wrong view whichever side you're on. If you're on the Waldo side, it looks too bad. If you're on the Southtown side, it looks too good. So the zip codes can be helpful, but you need to look at them with caution when you're looking at demographics from zip codes. CLR search is, but yeah, you got all sort of median household income. There's pretty much everything but crime. Unfortunately, they don't have crime data in the city data map function. CLR search and Best Place both have good zip code data. This is CLR search crime data for Grandview, Missouri, for example. Property values, Zillow, Redfin, both of those sites have estimates. Truly it is not, but it has a lot of other information. This is a Zestimate. Always take this with a major grain of salt. It might be a good place to start, but I mean, they're taking in large aggregates. They don't, when there are one area is across the tracks, and that's a lot lower end than the other area, but it's right next door. They're not going to take that into account. They don't take into account the conditions. So be very careful with this estimate. Actually, just don't use it. That'd be a better way to go. Rental value. Rental meter is a decent place to start, but that's another one kind of like the Zestimate. Don't use it like this. You're just trying to get a broad view, because if you type in, like, I think it's $1,000 at this place, and you put it into rental meter, that becomes a comparable. And so it's just people guessing, kind of. Good place to start, but don't rely on it. My favorite is Craigslist, actually. You just go to Craigslist, go to its map feature, just look around your property. And so the main thing to know, you got to click on each one, because you don't want to compare the studio next door to the 4-bedroom house. You got to make sure you're comparing like to like, but just look all around it. You're only getting actives, but it's pretty much close enough. You're not getting like closed leases. We don't have that sort of data with residential properties, but it's still very helpful. Zillow also has stuff like that, so does Trulia. And RentRange.com does cost a little bit, but it does provide a very detailed rental report. And then there's some other sites. GreatSchools.org is highly recommended. There's pretty much nothing that parents care more about when it comes to finding a place than finding somewhere in a good school district. Walk score can be helpful to figure out how easy it is to walk around places in Kansas City. Unless you live on the plaza or downtown, you can't. Crime mapping, I'm not a huge fan of crime mapping sites. Kind of get a broad view of what's around it, but I do not think they include everything. Much better to get actual crime data. Anyway, this is from greatschools.org. Just you get breakdown on all sorts of test scores, college success, etc. A lot of paid services. The MLS is the best, but you have to be a real estate agent to get access to the MLS. That being said, if you can get in touch with a investment-minded real estate agent, they can be very helpful in providing all sorts of comps, comparative market analysis, other data, etc. CoStar, if you're going to get into commercial real estate, they bought out LoopNet, so LoopNet is mostly just kind of I don't even know why it still exists really, but CoStar is pretty much necessary if you're going to be getting into commercial real estate. There's very geographic information systems like Argus are extremely detailed, but they do cost quite a bit of money. And there are a lot of reports, some of them are free, like Colliers offers an annual report on all of the major real estate industries out there. So you get office, industrial, multifamily. It gives you a report on how it's doing, how they think it will do. Marcus and Millichap has a report with regards to the economic environment in general. MLS reports are good. You can get them from a real estate agent or whatnot, but like the number of pending sales, how that's been going, days on market, you can go by area. The city has an economic development plan, and also I check the Kansas City Business News, the Kansas City Business Journal, I'm sorry, because one of the best things you want to look for is where the jobs are going. So this is just, if you're really getting into it, well actually let's go back to this one. The GIS, this is Argus. You can get crime data for block groups. You can get drive times from particular spots. You can get extremely detailed demographic information, but again, that costs quite a bit of money. So the things you're looking for increasing home values, or at least stable home values, increasing population. You don't like, for example, Grandview at one point I think was the 7th fastest dying city in Kansas City, or in the country. That's not a place, you don't really want to invest at that time, but we'll come back. But then IHOP came in to Grandview, and then after that, the Intermodal and Honeywell came in just south in Grandview. That was a great time to start buying Grandview. So that's why it's good to check in where the job's going in. And that's why you're looking at like Kansas City Business Journal and things like that. When you hear that the Intermodal is going down there, that's a good time to get in. When Cerner just, announced that they were going to be building the largest office development in the history of Kansas City, where the old Bannister Mall was, that was a great time to buy around there, and we did that quite a bit. So you do want to be checking where the jobs are coming in. Low crime is, of course, something to look for. Good schools, increasing rents, or at least stable rents. High occupancy, and this you can really see driving around. If there's a lot of boarded up properties, or properties that have burnt out and aren't being fixed, or just lawns that are just overgrown and haven't been taken care of, you can tell there's a lot of vacancy, but a lot of sites like CLR Search and Best Places also have vacancy rates as well. Per capita and household income, you don't want to go too far below the median unless you're specializing in low-income housing. The unemployment rate, of course, education levels is a little bit less or so, but something to look at. And then economic diversification. If it's all reliant on one thing, like Detroit was, that puts you at a higher risk. So the next we want to look at the value and financial estimate. So there are 4 main calculations that we use. The most, we're going to focus mostly on a comparable market analysis to try and make sure that we're all into this property for 75% of its market value. We can refinance out all or most of the money that we put into it. That would successfully burr out. And we have that equity cushion. Well, also the rent to cost, which is very straightforward, cap rate and cash flow, which have mostly to do with apartments. We'll discuss that shortly too. So this is a property that we just got, actually. It's up in north of the river. It's a 2-bed, 1-bath, 773 square foot house that was built in 1940. Very simple, no garage, no basement, but very cheap, only $26,500, although it is a bit of a wreck. It will require about $30,000 fix up, and it's a small house. So we're going to run through this real quick. We're going to go back. We're going to do a quick demographic analysis, and then we'll do a CMA, which is a comparative market analysis. So the property is located in this block group here. That block group has a $57,000 $57,000 median income per household, which is just barely above the national average. So we're looking at a very, lower middle class neighborhood. Nothing special, but good for rentals for sure. Violent crime is slightly below the national, slightly above the national average. Property crime is a little bit below. This again, it's a lower middle class neighborhood. Very good for rentals. Nothing special, nothing to write home about, but exactly what we want in terms of rentals. In terms of being right in the middle, which is where the school district is, rated 5 out of 10. So the first thing we're going to do, this is the MLS, and again, you would have to be a real estate agent to get access to this, but you can always find a good real estate agent and ask them to do something along these lines for you. This is what we're going to look for. First of all, we're going to look at active, pending, show for backups, and sold. I don't care if somebody was withdrawn. Well, I care a little bit, but if something was withdrawn or expired, it's not really comparable. It's not something we really want to look at. Only want to look at houses. Single-family condos are no good for us. Generally, you want to get it within the last 6 months. Sold in the last 6 months, at least in the last 12. If it goes beyond that, it's becoming very, very sketchy whether you can compare it all. I split the difference. We're doing 9 on this one. Same bedrooms and baths. Now, there is a discrepancy between 2 beds and 3 beds. 3 beds is like the bare minimum for like a family. 2 bedrooms, you might get roommates or a couple with no children or something like that, or just one person. But 3 bedroom is really when you start to get people who will stay for a while. 2 bedrooms is a bit more transient. And so so when I'm usually comparing, I might compare a 3 bedroom to a 4 bedroom, but I usually try not to compare a 2 bedroom to a 3 bedroom. And then finally, this property was built in 1940. So we're going to look at properties that were built between 1920 and 1960. You usually want to be about 15 years apart. You don't want to compare new construction to something that was built in 1920 or something like that. And so this is what we find. This is the map. All of the sales are in black. Actives are in green. And a lot of people this is where our house is, right? A lot of people just take a diameter. They just go within a mile or something like that. I am not a fan of doing that because this highway here, this area is quite a bit different than what's west of it. It's quite a bit different than what's east of it. It's like across the tracks, right? So there's these natural barriers, and you usually don't want to cross them. So I don't like this doing a diameter. In this case, I took everything around there. Like these houses are just as far away as these houses are from our subject. But because of the natural barrier there, I'll take the ones south, but not the ones west. So we got all these properties. We go down from 40,000 all the way to 133,000. So that's a massive discrepancy. So we've got to dig deeper and figure out which ones actually make sense to use. And this is what a full listing looks like, just so you know. Now you can ask your real estate agent to put together something called a CMA, which is a comparative market analysis, and it looks something like this. There are all sorts of different things they can include or not include. But this is a list of all the active properties, pending properties, sold properties. Now, the MLS data often is missing certain things that you got to go find. Like if you can see here, there's almost none of them have the square footage. Very odd. And when I was in Oregon, we came from Oregon originally. Price per square footage was like gospel. That was what it was. In Kansas City, it's important, but it's not as important as some other things. So it varies by the market, but there is some stuff missing here that we'll find here in a second. Then it can compare them just across the line. So this is just straight up compare. These are not the Beacon property we're looking at. This is another one. And then give you all sorts of different sorts of reports, price per square footage, average days on market. This is 244 days on market, which is a very long time. That means these properties are sitting. And then you can get some graphical representations and the like. I like to export the CMA or those comps I had into Excel, which is an easy thing you can do from the MLS, or you can ask your real estate agent to export them. And then I have these key categories. And then a couple of them, like with the square footage, they didn't have them, so I had to go to the, you can go to the county records. Actually, usually they're on the MLS as well, but you can go directly to the county's website, go to the tax, and look up the amount of square footage that there is for each of these properties as well. And then we just go down each one of them to figure out whether or not they make sense. So this first one, Wheeling, is only 558 square feet. That's 200 square feet less than ours. I don't know how a 558 square feet house could be 2 bedrooms. That's not a good comp. This next one is a pretty solid comp, though. And so is the one after that. So 44th and 45th are both solid comps, although they're both active. One's active, one's pending. The next one wheeling there is an REO. That's bank owned. And remember, we are comparing the after repaired value. So right now, our subject house, the house we're under contract on, Beacon, is basically in ruins. But we're comparing what it will be when we're finished rehabbing it with these other comps. So I don't care what it is now, it's what it will be. So this is an REO and it's not in good shape. We never want to compare to REOs if we ever can, because REOs always sell for less. The next one is also in pretty bad shape. It's listed as a fixer on the website. Now these next ones, 45th, Lister, Wheeling, and 48th, they're all solid comps. 46th is kind of on the fence. It looks quite a bit nicer, so we won't take it. And then 44th is much nicer. 46th and 49th, the final two here, are both much bigger and much nicer. So we just take out all those ones that are red that we went through. And these four are the solds that we really like. These two are both, this is active, this is pending, so these are the four we're going to look at the closest. Basically, this right here is 49th, which as you can see is not at all comparable to that house, even though it's a 2-bed, 1-bath. So we want that one, we don't want this one. Things to look for. Square footage is extremely important. You want to compare between the square, you don't want houses that are much bigger or much smaller. Bathrooms is very comparable. I would not compare a 1-bath to a 2-bath. 2-bath to a 2.5 is fine, but you need to make some adjustments. You don't want foreclosures. Oh, I missed one there. Look at the pictures online. See if the condition is similar. If there are holes in the wall and or extremely dated, that's a property that you either need to make a major adjustment to or more likely just not include in your comparison. You want the age to be similar. Bedrooms are a secondary thing. You want to look at them too, but it's not quite as critical other than that 2 to 3 gap. Garage and basement certainly need adjustments. I've noticed that generally estate sales and also investor sales, which is both noted on the MLS, sell for a little bit less, generally speaking, but not like foreclosures. I still will use those as comparables, whereas foreclosures are just out. And also the other one there is short sales. It's listed as short sale, those also, and that's when somebody's behind on their mortgage and the bank allows them to sell for less than the mortgage is. And those generally sell for a little bit less too. The style is important, so like splits and ranches won't sell for the same per square footage basis. That being said, this can be a little deceptive. If you walk into a split level, you immediately have a staircase. One goes upstairs, one goes downstairs. If you go downstairs, you're usually a little bit underground, but only about like right there. Like the ground level's like right here. And you can look outside the window and all the rest of it. That is generally not considered above grade square footage. It's not included in the square footage. It's considered a finished basement, which is not really how most homeowners or most renters would think of it. And so that is not really a fair comparison. So you just need to take that in mind. Whereas it's like a ranch and a split that had the same square footage, the ranch would sell for more. The split really has more square footage because it has this basically finished area that's not included, because they consider it a finished basement, which is not, in my judgment, fair. You also want to look at the days on market. If it's been on the market for a long time, or the price, or it sells for a price that's over asking. Well, let's say it's been on the market for a long time. That might mean it's not. They should have sold it for less. If it's been on the market for a very short time, it might be worth more, especially if it sells for more than asking. Like if there's some that are way off. If it listed for $50,000 and sold for $65,000, the people who are making offers on it probably are trying to get a good deal, and that's not a very good comp. The description, if it says something like buyer backed out or motivated seller, that probably means it's sold for less than there's something wrong with the property, or you should take that into account. Seller concessions. This is often listed at the bottom of the listing, and you need to watch out for that too, because let's say it's a $3,500 concession, $95,000 sale. It's really a $91,500 sale, and so that's something to keep your eye on. You may need to look at the county records to find the square footage or things like that, and also if there's no picture on the MLS, that means 99 times out of 100 it's a fixer. So if no picture, it means it's in bad shape. So I just went through these properties real quick, these 4 properties. What we're doing is we're thinking like an appraiser. And what appraisers will do is they'll make adjustments to a property to make them all the same. That's what they're trying to. So let's say you have this house at 4313 Northeast 45th. We're trying to make it the same as Beacon. So it's about almost 100 square feet bigger, so we'll make an adjustment down. We'll reduce the price of that as if we're reducing the size of the house. It's got a basement, so we'll again do that. We're getting rid of its basement, we're reducing its price. But it's not in as good a shape, but it sold almost 6 months ago, and the prices have gone up a little bit since then, so we'll increase the price. And it only had window units, whereas ours will have HVAC, so we'll increase the price again. And we just go through that whole process. We're making these properties as much the same as we can. And so we come up with these adjusted sale prices: $87,400, $90,000, $80,500, and $94,000. So if we average that, we get $87,975. And then I also run through it, just do the price per square foot, which is $107.32 per square foot. If you multiply that number, that's these four houses, their average price per square foot. If you multiply that number by the square footage of Beacon, 773, it becomes $82,961. So this house is probably worth between $80,000 and $90,000, and we'll just settle about $85,000. Remember, it's not a science, it's sort of not an art, it's kind of in between. It's part science, part art, and it's a range. You always think of this in terms of a range. You're not exactly sure where it will be. And the worse your comps are, the less confident you can be in that number. So if your comps are either further away, you need to make more adjustments because there's no 2 bedrooms, there's only 3 bedrooms, or if they've all sold a long time ago. This is often true with rural property. If it's really far away, rural property is really hard to compare because there aren't that many and they're far away and they sold a long time ago or something like that. You just have to be much more careful with a bigger range and less confident in your numbers. This is what an actual appraisal looks like. They just go down all these numbers. Like here you can see there was a concession, so they dropped the $2,820 because that was a concession from the seller to the buyer. The square footage is a little bit different, so they made an adjustment. You don't need to put together this detailed report, but you want to think in the same way. Some of you have probably heard of the 70% rule. It's a pretty good rule of thumb when working with this. It's just your after repair value multiplied by 0.7, and then that number minus the rehab, which equals your max offer. This is a good way to see how much, if you're selling the property, how much equity you have in it. You can also, we usually just look to make sure it's at 0.75 so we can refinance out all or very close to all of the money we put into it. You can also run down it individually and just say like, okay, this is going to cost $500 for title and $1,000 for my loan fees or whatever. That's a good way to do it too. But this is a really good rule of thumb, and so we'll just run through it on this one. Our after repair value is $85,000. We'll get to the rehab here shortly, but purchase price is $27,500. Estimated rehab is $30,000. So let's do the numbers. $85,000 times 0.7 equals $59,500. And that minus $30,000 equals $29,500, which is my max acceptable offer. And we got it for $27,500. Rent to cost is very simple. I add the closing cost as 2 loans, our private loan up front and then refinancing it plus our closing costs. Just making it even $60,000. Rent, my estimate for it is $895. And so $895 divided by $60,000 is 1.49%. Now the big thing about rent to cost is you want to only compare like areas, preferably the same area. If you compare Ruskin to Mission Hills, you're not going to, it's not going to work. Well, first of all, if you're renting in Mission Hills, you're doing something wrong. Or doing something right, but very stupidly right. I'm not sure. But yeah, so this is one of our best rent to costs in a long time. We used to aim for about 1.5% in areas like this or Grandview, but generally it's gone down. Right now we try to get at least 1%. And if you real quick, if you ever heard of the 2% rule, where you want to get 2% rent to cost, throw that away. It's the worst rule ever. It will send you right into war zones and Skid Row. You will only get 2% on paper. It's a good way to bankrupt yourself. Cap rates, we'll talk about this real quick. This is just the net operating income of a property divided by its price. So this is really used for apartment complexes, but you can use it for houses too. The tricky part is the expenses can be really variant, like if you have a move out or a big turnover or if they just stay. So our rental income, $895 a month for 12 months is $10,740. We'll put a vacancy rate at 10%, which is pretty moderate. Expenses, there's the 50% rule. There are all these rules, 7% rule, 2% rule, 50% rule. 50% rule just says that your expenses, your operating expenses will be a half of your income. That is really high for houses. It's usually less. It's more like probably more like 40%. But we'll throw it in here anyways, just because. So our net operating income is $4,833, and then the cap rate is just $4,833 divided by the price of the property, $60,000, 8.05. And we're generally looking for, I mean, it depends on the area. The cap rate is useful for apartments so much so because every apartment's different. You can't make them the same. You can't turn, this 60 unit into this 47 unit. So you boil it down to this one number, which is just the, how much money is it bringing in versus how much does it cost. But you got to compare similar areas. You can't compare a really bad area to a really good area with the cap rate. But generally, we want to be above 8. It used to be above 10, but things got tougher. Cash on cash return is just, we'll start with cap rate, same thing. Got $4,833. Now, we're going to assume we get a 75% loan on this. 75% loan, $45,000, 8% interest only. That's $3,600 a year, which leaves us a cash flow of $1,233, $102 per unit per month, which is really what we aim for, at least $100 fully financed on houses. But this is high, so we're going to say it's okay. 75 for apartments. And then the cash on cash return is just your net operating income divided by how much money you put into the property. Not how much what the price is, how much money you put into it. So in this case, we put in $15,000 and got a $45,000 loan. So it's $1,233, our cash flow, divided by the amount of money we put in, $15,000, and it gets an 8.2% cash on cash return, which is actually a little low. If we had fully financed it, our cash on cash return would be infinite. So that doesn't really work that well. This is how it looks on an apartment complex. There are 10 key numbers, 10 key expense items. 4 are fixed, not quite. The taxes, you want to go with the previous year generally. The insurance, probably about $250 a unit. Utilities, go with the previous year. The management fee is about 10% unless there's on-site management. So if there's like a leasing agent, property manager who work at the property, then it's usually 4%, and you pay their salary. The variable costs, repairs, we usually go between $500 and $700 a unit. That's turnover and maintenance. Contract services was like snow removal or cleaning the hallways or things like that. It's about $200 to $400 a unit. This is per year, by the way. General administration, $100 to $250. Marketing, $50 to $150. Payroll, if there are people, if there's somebody who works on staff. I mean, if it's off-site, then you just have a higher management fee, and that's zero. But it's usually $800 with $1,100. And the reserve, or your recurring capital expenses. These are items like, the roof will go out once every 30 years, but if you're going to own this property long term, you need to account for that. So this is basically accounting for long-term capital projects, not short-term operating expense, not maintenance, but like the HVAC going out and stuff like that. With apartments, it's usually about $3,000 to $5,000 a unit per year. Houses a little bit more than that. So a couple tips with cap rates: use real numbers whenever possible. Try to get their actual numbers from the previous year and use those. If the actuals are lower than the range I just mentioned, or they just seem really low, bump them up to the minimum. Like, you just assume that they're not special. It will cost at least the minimum. If you can looking to get a RUBS program, if it's all bills paid. So if the apartment's paying all, if you have to pay the water or the electricity and the gas, you can put in a utility chargeback or a RUBS program, which just charges that takes the total utilities for the building, charges about 95% of that back to the tenants. You can't make a profit on it, so it's usually set at 95%. Make sure to account for economic vacancy. Don't just assume because people are in a unit, that's good. If they're not paying, it's actually worse. And deals are often done with apartment deals are often done with equity partners, or usually through a syndication. And this is just something you need to account for, that you're splitting the equity in different ways. And so the cash on cash, the cash flow, cash on cash return, all those things get a little more complicated. Briefly go over more complicated numbers. This is something to look into if you're going to get into apartments and office buildings. Return on investment is just the annualized return on investment for the entire course of the investment. So this example, the total return was $268,000 on your $200,000 investment over 10 years, which is a 134% return or 13.45% return per year. This is a lot better than cap rates in a way because cap rates don't take into account how much you're going to sell it for, how much you're going to make next year, how fast rents will grow, etc. But you've got to assume a lot. You got to estimate what you're going to sell it for, what your income is going to be. So it's a lot more assumptions, but it gives you a bigger picture. The best is, of course, the internal rate of return, which is the discount rate that makes the net present value of all cash flows from an investment equal to zero. It looks like this, so obviously you guys got that now. So no, basically what the internal rate of return does is cash now is better than cash later because you can invest it and make a return. So internal rate of return looks at when you get the money and when you spend it. So it's almost always lower than the ROI. So in this case, it's the exact same thing as last time, but you're only making 11%. There are a lot of calculators for IRR. Again, it requires a lot of assumptions, but because it takes into account when that money is received and when it's paid, it gives you a fuller picture of what's happening. And again, this is usually only used for apartments, office buildings, and the like, rarely used for houses. So now we're going to move to the rehab estimate. Moving right along. So a couple quick tips before we get started. Don't spend too much time before you've got it under contract. You're going to be looking at a lot of properties. You don't need to spend 2 hours. Try to get it done in 10 minutes or so. Have a checklist. We'll go over that in a second. Take pictures if possible. You want something to reference. You don't want to go off your memory. Learn construction costs. We'll talk about that in a second. Don't be afraid to ask for help, other investors, ask contractors for bids. Don't abuse that. Like ask a contractor to help go through a property, give you an idea of what's going on. You don't want to ask them over and over and over again. They're going to stop picking up your calls, but it's not a bad way to start. Don't forget your holding costs. A lot of people strangely do this. Especially if you're getting a loan, if this rehab is going to take 6 months, you got to count 6 months of loan costs. Even if you don't have a loan, you got to account for insurance and taxes and utilities, and you also got to count you got money that's not working for you. So always make sure to account for your hold costs. And I always add a contingency, and I would recommend everyone add a contingency. We put 20%. That depends. Jay Scott, for example, just takes the high estimate for everything he does. Like, so he's thinking the toilet costs around 150 to 200 or something like that. He'll always go with 200. The reason for this is because you were always going to miss something, or something will come up that you couldn't have seen, like it's behind a wall. There's no way you really can't tell. Or it works, but it doesn't work once it's had a load. So like, let's say you test a faucet, it works. But when somebody actually lives there or is actually working on the property, it can only last a couple of days of that and then breaks. That stuff happens all the time. I've never heard of an investor in my entire life who's complained about over budgeting. It's not a thing. It doesn't exist. Every mistake is made the other way, under budgeting. And so I always add a contingency and always recommend that you do as well. As far as learning construction costs, contractor bids are the best way, I think. Getting several bids up front, you can see kind of the ranges of these different items, and you should always ask for itemized bids. Never say like, give me what the whole thing will cost is one number, or even by room. It's worthless. Doesn't do you any good. They'll hide large expenses in there often. If there's a big expense on something that doesn't make sense, you can just cross it off and not have them do it. And it's a good way to learn those costs too. So, this ceiling fan is costing $125 or $175, and indoor door is costing $125, $150. These numbers start to just come ingrained in your mind. Of course, a lot of that depends on the material quality you're using too. Talking to other investors is always a good thing, getting their feedback. Talking to contractors, again, you can ask them to go through, give you an idea what they're thinking. Again, don't abuse that. Buying people lunches or coffee is a good way to get a few of these in, a few freebies. You can go into Bigger Pockets and ask for feedback. Home Advisor, they've got estimates about different things. They're very broad, and I'm not a big fan of it, but you can look at it. I do recommend that everyone buy this book. It's by Jay Scott. It's the book on estimating rehab costs. It's very high quality, and it's really the only book on this subject that I've ever seen. And it's one of the biggest challenges that real estate investors have, and everyone's screwing it up. So highly recommend buying it. He broke it down into 25 categories of items that there are. I split it, made it 26. I split foundation and basement. And we just have this sheet. And this is my one-page sheet. When I walk through a house, I fill this sheet out. I make estimates for all the different items. Oh, actually, This is it's on this page. Reviewing your results is really important. Okay, we'll talk about that real quick and then we'll come back. So every property we do, even the worst ones, we always review the results because the best way to figure out what a property will cost is what the previous one that was similar to it costed you. Now, a lot of people don't like looking at this because it's often bad, but I mean, if you're basically budgeting blind, and then you're budgeting off of your mistaken belief about what budgeting worked on your next one if you're not actually reviewing your results. But the funniest story is the Sydney Opera House. They budgeted at $7 million and it ended up costing 102. So, I'm not kidding you. Anyways, back to the sheet. This is our sheet. So I fill out each of these items. I just put a dollar figure based on them, make a couple of notes here if I need to. And so, we've got, roof, gutters, soffits and fascia, siding, exterior paint, just all the way down to the bottom. And then I add a little bit for knickknacks, sewer line contingency if it's an older house. That's especially in an area that sewer lines are bad. So if I know like Grandview's got terrible sewer lines, I'll probably put a $1,000 contingency there. Electrical contingency if I feel like the electrical is really sketchy, like if it's off and it looks like an old panel or something like that, I might put a little bit of money there. Punch out items, just that little cost at the end. Holding costs, how long do I think it's going to hold, add it up, and then I add the full contingency, and then I add all this stuff together and I have an estimate. It looks like this when it's done, although this is our real estate agent put this together. He gets a little lazy, didn't fill that number in. But he did do the math at least, so I'm going to call him out on that. Philip, actually, could you hand out that copy? And if people want a copy of this, I'd be happy to send it out, maybe have Kim email it out to everybody. But this is a copy of our one-page sheet, and it's just real quick and simple to go over. So here are a few things to look for when you're going through. If you see a fuse box with these little circular fuses in there, those need to be replaced. They're old, they're bad. You need to put an electrical panel in there. Usually costs about $1,000 to thereabout. Also keep your eye out for Federal Pacific panels. These are garbage, they do nothing. They don't, electrical panel is supposed to trip, so if there's an overload, it turns off. These don't, so they're just there for show. These smaller ones will say Federal Pacific on them. On the panel, it will say, like right there, you can barely see it, Federal Pacific. I've only seen them in apartments, but so I've never seen one in a house. But I've seen these in houses. These are Pushmatic panels. These are better. Most electricians will say you should replace them. They do work. I've heard mixed things, but generally these are not good and generally need to be replaced. They're just Pushmatic because you just push. If you ever see foundation cracks, that's a problem. You can epoxy them, but if they're going sideways, that's a bigger problem than if they're going up and down. Up and down, you can usually just epoxy them and brace them. This can be a much more serious issue. It's actually called a hydrostatic crack. Mold is something to keep your eye out for. So you just see like mold on the bottom here. If you ever see them cut, like the drywall just cut up from the bottom to the middle or something like that, always means there was mold here. Now mold is easy to get rid of. If it's just a tiny little bit, you can just kill it. If there's a lot like that, you can just cut it all out. The problem is always making sure it doesn't come back, because mold comes from water and dark places. That's where mold comes from. Most mold is actually not toxic, but good luck telling a tenant that. And then, so the key is like, how's the water getting in? Is it a leak? Is it coming? Is there bad grading outside? Is it just nobody been there? It's just gotten really musty for a long time. I mean, the big key is figuring out why is there water there, and that's the thing you have to determine during your due diligence. If it's very simple, like the grading's terrible or the sump pump is broke, was broke several years ago, okay, that's good. If you don't know where it's coming from, that could be a big problem because you might not be able to get rid of it. Roofs. If you ever see this kind of sogginess, or if the shingles are lipping up, that means the roof is very near the end of its life. In addition, you can look at the side of it and you can see how many layers there are. There should only be one. If there's two, that's bad. If there's three, that's really bad. If there's 3 layers or more, it almost certainly means not only is the roof shot, but the decking beneath it is shot. And you're gonna have to pay, that's just the plywood that they put at the bottom. You're gonna have to pay to rip off substantially more and rip off this decking and replace it, and it's gonna be almost twice the cost. We're actually dealing with that right now. So that's something to keep your eye on. Saggy or lipping up means bad. Other things to look for, ungrounded electrical outlets. Now there are a lot of ungrounded older houses. It's very expensive to upgrade this, so it's not a lot you can do, but it is something you wanna be aware of. You can just get an electrical tester from Home Depot to do that. Plumbing leaks, I'd run the water if you can get the utilities on. Make sure there's no leaks in the basement. Make sure check underneath the sinks. So make sure check around the the stool, the toilet there, and make sure it's not like soggy and soft. That means there's been a leak and there's dry rot. Galvanized plumbing, it just looks like steel plumbing and it rusts. And so you can often just see it very, very rusty. Like it's very obvious. You can also, galvanized plumbing is not necessarily something you gotta get rid of, but you do need to make sure it's not been rusted. And that's, you test the water pressure. If there was very little water pressure or if the water is brown, that means you need to replace the plumbing because it's galvanized. And then you also want to take a good look at the furnace and the AC. They are expensive items. Make sure they're not old, rusty, and if you can test them, it's good. Unfortunately, it's hard to test the AC in the summer. So, okay, we're gonna move on. Now we've got the property under contract. We're going to start with the physical due diligence. First, a couple things about just contracts in general. If you have a realtor provided contract, that's great. If you don't, or if the seller provided it, make sure to check with an attorney about it. There will be an earnest money deposit. You got to put usually $1,000 for a house, usually 1% for an apartment or something like that. You have an inspection period, which is usually either 10 or 15 days for a house. Closing is in 30. Or for a larger property, apartment, office, industrial, it'll usually be 30 days, and the closing will be in 60. And that's an important date because once that date has been hit, your earnest money is hard and you can no longer get it refunded. And so you close dates, you cannot, even still, most sellers want to sell. So if you like for our part, when we do a larger, well, actually with anything we do, we always put in the agreement, or at least we ask for it. I don't think we had a single person turn us down on it, for the ability to buy a second extension. So we can put down more earnest money. We're not paying anymore. We just put down another earnest money payment. We get another 15 or 30 days. Just in case a loan doesn't come through or something like that, we don't want to put our earnest money at risk. And then contingencies and access. I'd always make sure that you have access in the they will give you access in the contract. And the most likely contingency is a financing contingency. Some sellers will have problems with that. But if you put it in a financing contingency and you're unable to get financing, you can still get your earnest money back even after the inspection period is gone. But a lot of sellers will have problems with that contingency. All right, so physical due diligence. You might not have been able to get the utilities on for your original walkthrough, especially if it's bank-owned property, but you really want to try to get them on for your physical due diligence. Spend a long time. This will take at least an hour. You want to be very, very thorough. Again, have a checklist. Write legibly because you're going to be transcribing this, and take lots of pictures. Like we take a picture of every item. Most of our scopes of work have 100 to 300 line items. And so, yeah, and we take a picture for almost every single thing. Like if we're replacing a vent cover, we'll take a picture of it just so the contractor knows exactly what it is we're asking them to do. Note what you need a professional inspection for. I'd say with every new investor, you want to get at least a property inspection, but if there's something else in particular, a specialist you want to look at something, make sure to note that. Don't be afraid to go back. It's okay to be a pest to the seller. If you've missed something, go back. And walk every unit. If it's an apartment complex, it doesn't matter if it's 100 units. If you ask, oh, well, I'll just only see every other one, which ones do you think they're going to show you? The good ones or the bad ones? So, yeah. So walk every unit every time. This is what our scope of work worksheet looks like. It's 6 pages long. It's every single item. Like this is the lot, landscaping, tree trimming, grading. I just say yes, it needs it, doesn't need it, make some comments. If there's other items, go through here. And this just goes through the whole property. It goes to kitchen, bathroom 1, bathroom 2, living room, bedroom 1, bedroom 2. We can share this document as well. But let's do an example. So we're doing a scope of work. This is a property we bought a couple of years ago. Let's do some audience interaction here. So here's the first. We're looking at the outside. We're writing our sheet up. Anyway, and what items do we need to write on the sheet? Siding, right here. Okay. What's that? Right. This crack right here. You see? Okay. Anything else?
Possibly the strange shaped front door.
That's a window actually. The front door is a little bit over to the left. Yeah, it says no gutters. No gutters. So, first one, we need to insulate this, put the siding up, trim, and paint the trim. Fix the fascia board. This needs a fascia board right here for the gutter to go onto. Bark mulch and landscaping, make it look nice. Gutter and a downspout. And tuck point the brick facade. Okay, what about this one right here? Yeah, okay. AC's gone. So he grew legs and walked off. what good are it's an adventure to get up there. Okay. What's that? Basement window. Basement window is a bit of an, that's, I would probably not replace the basement window just because this basement is not very accommodating. It's these I love these gingerbread houses, but their basements are not that inviting. So yeah, we need AC compressor plus the line set. They grew legs and ran off. That's unfortunate. We might even want to put a cage on it because this is a little bit of a more higher crime area. And so cage costs about what, $350?
Yeah, that's
About $350, you put a cage on it, and it's not impenetrable, but you don't have to make your stuff. You just need to make it harder to steal than your neighbors. And I shouldn't have said, cut that, okay. You need steps for the stairs unless you want to have an adventure. And spindles and rail, this is pretty open and not very great, so you need to do that. Cable box where it's broken, and then replace the rotten piece of trim and paint to match. So right here, this is rotten. It's hard to see that. Now the thing is, touch-up paint is really tough, but you can just paint this entire board, and it just has to be close. If you've got different, like the trim and the body, and there's different, that's something to keep in mind, like ways to not paint everything if you're doing touch-up. Okay, what about this one? This is my favorite, I think. The trampoline? So we got a trampoline. We definitely could use that. All right. We have wood rot right here. We could fix that. Get a new fascia board in there. This is like this is the back of the house. And so this is a door that leads to the basement. So it's a walkout basement, but it feels more like a walkout dungeon. Oh yeah, fascia. I didn't even see that. You're missing the gutter right there. Yeah. So we could use a deck. And so that's what a deck. Repair that trim board right there. Add stairs to the deck. Add spindles, rails, and stain the deck, and then repaint and repair the door of the basement. This is pretty roughed up. You can see it's kind of the paint is starting to peel off, so we want to repaint that. All right, let's move inside the house. This is the only time I've ever seen this problem. I don't know if anyone spot it. And I've probably been inside 2,000 houses maybe, and this is the only one I've ever seen this.
No outlets.
There is an outlet right here, but it's old. Sure, we're going to want to replace that. Any guesses?
The lights will go under the lights.
Under the lights? We do need to replace these light fixtures, the switches, because they're old and yellow, and I think and they just look awful and gross. And new light switches and outlets are really cheap, and they make the house look a lot newer. So we almost always replace those.
Is the floor stripped all the way to the base?
Yeah, you're very close. This has been sanded all the way down. It has not been refinished though. And so the weird thing is they did not sand the edges. That still needs. So we need to go around and sand the edge of this entire room and then refinish the floors. I know. Yeah, they did the easy part and then got out. Well, actually, I think we bought this in bank, so they did the easy part and then got foreclosed on. So, but sand the edges of the floors only, and then buff and stain them. Clean the walls, possibly a little bit of touch-up paint. Touch-up paint is really, really tough. So, if you can save it, that's good because I mean, how much? We have one guy who can kind of do it more or less. 1.5. And then new outlets and covers. Okay, kitchen. Aren't those some cabinets right there? Sorry, I'm getting a little fuzzy here. What's that? New countertop. Yeah, butcher block is garbage.
What don't you like about it?
I don't know. I just don't like it. This is more of a personal thing. I should probably make that noted. That's an opinion. That being said, the new butcher block, I like that. The old butcher block, I don't know. To each his own, each their own. But I'm not a fan.
What do you rather?
I mean, the best would just be like a granite slab, but for mica, I prefer just like stuff you get at Home Depot or Lowe's, or a tile countertop. But so the main thing is to paint the kitchen cabinets and also replace the poles. The poles here. That often will bring it, like those poles get dated real quick, so they can make it look a lot nicer. It's not cheap. Countertop, because I don't like butcher block. Appliances. Dishwashers are really nice, and this has got a lot of space. You can put a dishwasher right here, so you can remove this. You don't want to remove all of your cabinet. You want to make sure there's sufficient cabinet space. If you remove this, put a dishwasher in right here and plumb it. And that's very simple to plumb because it's so close. And then you can't see that, but regrout the tile floor and install GFCI. GFCI outlets, ground fault circuit interrupter. You want to have them in any bathroom and kitchen, anywhere near water, because they shut off immediately, and so people don't get electrocuted. All right, final one, and this one's not a good picture, but so this is the bathroom. What's that? Oh yeah, that's not high quality. It looks like a stadium restroom or something like that.
Panels over the toilet.
Yes. The toilet is right here. You can't see it very well because it's a terrible picture. Fortunately, I couldn't go back. Yes, new vanity for sure. Okay, let's take a look. So we got, you can't see that again, regrout the tile, but replace the vanity because it's terrible. Blinds for the window. Install GFCI, and here I don't think there's a medicine cabinet here, so you might want to put a medicine cabinet right there. Can't really tell. Bad picture. So last one right here. So this is pretty simple, just in a room here. What do we got? Closet door. Anything other than the closet door?
Possibly a ceiling fan.
Yeah. Could need a ceiling fan.
Outlet cover.
Okay, yeah. Or I'd probably replace the outlet completely, just because get them. Don't forget about the door stops. That's a good way to get holes in your wall. So always make sure to add door stops, both the front door for the door and the outlet cover and the outlet. And maybe the door handle. This door handle is very old. Get a nice brass one in there. So this is kind of the process of going through. Oh, I got one more here. We'll just go through this one quickly. This duct is not doing anything, so you need to run ductwork and vents. Pin up the PEX plumbing. A lot of times in the basement, the plumbing is just hanging there. Pin it up to the rafters. And fill in this gap here. You might use foam for that, but be extraordinarily careful. It expands. Everybody screws up foam. It's terrible. And then clean out all the garbage. So that's kind of the process. You go through all of those things, and then we fill out this scope of work, and we put it into 4 sections. And so the first one is pre-construction work. Pre-construction is anything that needs to be done for the construction to start. So this could be the electricals all shot. Let's say the panel's been, like some copper thief came in and ripped out all the wiring in the panel. You need to put that back in before you can start the work. Or the most common is there's just a bunch of junk and you need to remove it. So anything like that, anything that needs to happen before the job can start. Then we break it into the main construction side of it. And this is everything done by the general contractor, if you're just having a main handyman or perhaps your employees on staff, everything done that's not being done by basically a specialist. Now you might do it differently. If you subcontracting every single thing, you might have just a long list of subcontractors. But we usually have a key guy, a main handyman, general contractor employee doing the work. So we put in that as the construction side. Then we have the vendor list, which is everything other than that done by a specialist. So let's say the contractor's not doing the painting, so we'll have the painter. They almost never do the carpet or carpet and vinyl person. The appliances, maybe the HVAC, the electrical, all of those things that is done by a particular specialist or particular vendor. And then the punch out is the last items. Those are the things you don't want to do particularly before the paint. So this would be like putting the blinds in, putting the outlet covers on, putting light fixtures on, installing the appliances, the final cleaning, those things. And then we put it into Smartsheet, which looks like this. Now again, this is our way of doing it. You don't have to do exactly the same, but you want to have a consistent process, that checklist that you go all the way through. Ours is Smartsheet. It's like Excel on steroids. We have each of the items. So there's no pre-construction here. This is where the construction begins. And then below this is the vendor list. Although we have done it other ways where it's the construction and then the punch out is just like another, instead of being all the way at the bottom, it's like the bottom of each of these sections. So there's a lot of ways to do it. You just want to do it the same each time. And then we have our budget, which we put a budget in for any of our rehabs. And that's the only we see. And then we send this sheet out to anyone who's bidding it, and they put their bid in. And if they have an item that, if they don't understand it, they make a note, or if they think there's something that they think we should do, they put that in there as well. They make a note there. And that way we're comparing like to like. Always ask contractors to use your sheet. If you get their version, their scope or their bid, and then you get another contractor's bid. Well, this contractor didn't bid items 6, 19, and 47. And this contractor didn't bid items 22, 93, and 104. And so, comparing them becomes very tricky. And especially since they, often they're in a PDF or something like that, and you can't directly compare them. So we always ask them to compare on our sheet. We don't show them what the other contractor did. That way we can just put the numbers right next to each other, and we can see which one's better.
Will you share that with us?
Yeah, I'll share an example with you. It's each one's different, but I'd have to share an example with you. Yeah. What's that?
I was just telling her Smartsheet's a website.
Oh yeah, it's a paid service, but yeah, I can't remember what it costs, but it's not bad. General tips: if you can't turn on the utilities, add an additional contingency. You just be more careful. Soon there's going to be more to repair. If you can't tell whether the foundation is coming in, now if it's more than 6 inches, you might have to push that wall back, and that can be close to $10,000. So, but you can go back on the outside and run your finger along the siding on the bottom. If it goes to it should go about to your second knuckle, and if it goes any further, that means the wall is starting to move in. And you can also just feel like if you're going along it and then it starts to go more and more and more, that means the wall is moving in. So that's a way to check the foundation wall from the outside. Generally don't finish the garage or attic. It doesn't make sense. Almost never finish basements because most basements get water in them. We're going to talk about that in a second. And with the exception, that's a section of a quick finish. We like to do a quick basement finish, which is really, we just paint the floor this gray color with oil-based paint so it doesn't scuff off, and paint the walls white, and that's it. And it looks kind of finished, especially if it's a walkout basement or a well-lit basement. And often appraisers will give us that on the appraisal as a finished basement, even though it's very cheap and we're not doing much. But do not spend a lot of money in a basement. You will not get it back out of the house. So for example, this is how we learned this. This is the house we had. My original budget was $34,000, and I made about every mistake you could possibly make. So for some reason, I only put a $1,000 contingency in instead of 20%. I had no holding costs. I don't know why. I don't know. The cabinets were unsalvageable. I thought I could paint them. I could have figured this out if I just spent a little bit longer, but it wasn't there long enough. The plumbing in the basement seemed to work. It turned on, but it didn't drain very well because there was no fall. All the plumbing just went straight across, so we had to redo that. The electrical also mostly didn't rework in this we'll call it the dungeon, the finished dungeon. And my estimate was generally too low, and the basement added very little value. It was a 4.2, but it really, the 1 bedroom and 1 bathroom in this finished basement, it added so little and we put so much into it. So we ended up spending almost $57,000 on one we budgeted $35,000 for. That's a sick feeling to have, but it does happen, and it's important to review these things, and this is a great lesson. No more finishing basements, even though it was half finished to begin with. It was half finished, and so we're like, let's just finish it all the way. No. Don't finish basements. All right, financial due diligence. So this is mostly for apartments. Now there is if the house is leased, you certainly want to do this due diligence, but most of it is getting all sorts of documents to make sure that what you think is true is true. So the T12, and that's just the previous 12 months of operating history, and you want to get a couple of years of that. You want to get a current rent roll, make sure see who's in it. Aged receivables report is a report that shows all of the who's behind on the rent and by how much, which is important because you'd rather have nobody in a unit than somebody who's not paying. A list of recent capital improvements. What have they done? Have they redone the roof? Have they done HVAC or anything like that? The last 2 months bank statements or deposit slips. We just bought this house actually in Shawnee. and there's a house that the owner lived in, and they're moving, and there's this tiny little house thing, a one-bedroom house that's also in the property, non-conforming unit. And so we asked for the deposit slip showing that that person had paid to make sure that, because they didn't have a lease, so we're going to sign a month-to-month lease with them because why not? But we're not going to do that if they're not current, so we asked for a deposit slip. You might get a little pushback on this, but you want to make sure that the money that they're asking, that they say is coming in, is actually coming in. And then you want to get the leases, and if it's in an HOA, like a condo or a house that's in an HOA, you want to get the HOA bylaws. It's very important as well. There are two key things to look for. Well, actually, there are a lot of key things to look for. The first one is bad debts. If they're using accrual accounting, and there's two kinds of accounting, cash accounting and accrual accounting. Cash accounting means if I spent money, I account for it whenever I spent it. So if the money, so I pay, let's say we're recarpeting this room. We recarpet this room in March. Okay, accrual accounting says we did it in March, we're paying for it in March, even if the check goes out in April. Cash accounting says the check went out in April, we're paying for it in April. There's a tricky thing with accrual accounting, though, is bad debts, because accrual accounting says we made all the income of all the units that are leased. So if you have $5,000 a month in income from these units, you made $5,000, and you charge off your bad debts. So if they didn't pay, you charge it off. So let's say you have $2,000 in bad debts, you come to the conclusion it's not going to come in, you charge it off. If they haven't charged off those bad debts, it can look a lot better than it actually is. You need to make sure you know whether or not they have bad debts that need to be charged off. The worst one is misallocated capital expenses. So capital expenses are things that on items that are going to last longer than a year. So your furnace, your AC, your roof, your foundation, things like this. Those are things that last over a year. That being said, a lot of landlords or owners, particularly if they're trying to make their books look good, will capitalize just about anything. They'll capitalize, I've seen carpets capitalized, turnovers capitalized, all sorts of things capitalized. In addition, you need to kind of remember that if you're going to be owning something long term, capital expenses on that property going forward are a recurring capital expense. They're a replacement reserve. If you're buying it and immediately doing an upgrade, yeah, that's a capital expense and you're just putting it on your balance sheet. It's not on your operating statement. It's not something that you evaluate like that's how well the property does year after year. But if you're just looking like you replace the furnace you replace one furnace every year, so we capitalize it. Well, if you know every year you're replacing a furnace, that is a reoccurring expense, and you need to be aware of that. So you need to know how much they're spending on capital expenses and making a decision on whether or not that belongs on the operating statement. If their expenses are really low, that probably means that they're hiding something or they're not doing their accounting right, and you should just assume it's going to be more than that. And often, if they're self-managing, they won't have a management fee. And so if they don't have a management fee, you've got to include it even if you're going to be self-managing, because any buyer will put a management fee in there and take that out of your net operating income. And so if you're buying it on a cap rate that assumes no management fee, you have no buyers to sell the property to that will assume that. You need to put a management fee in there. Okay, we'll go through an operating statement. This is for an apartment that we looked at one time. This one is really interesting because this number right here is collection loss, which is like, what does that mean? Well, this is collection loss. You asked the agent about it, but what this was in this case was they were offering major concessions, a month off, 2 months off, I think at one point. And if you see it, it starts up here. It's just kind of, it's not really going down. It kind of goes up and down and up and down. And that makes me think that their rents are actually higher. Like they might have the rent at say $600 a unit, but they can't rent it for that. You put that as a number into your sheet or into your pro forma, and you should never use the seller pro forma. Pro forma is an estimate of the future. Always build your own. The sellers are always false. They're always too optimistic. But this probably means that their rent is too high because they're giving all these concessions and they can just keep doing it. So that's something to keep your eye on. This is going into the expense side, so we're looking at all of these things. There are a couple of things that might just ask questions about right here. They have a payroll expense, jumps from $2,700 to $54,000 and then drops down again. What happened there? That's something you want to ask about. Did they hire somebody and then fire somebody? This right here is probably easily explainable, but you want to make sure you know. This is the utilities expense. It's consistently at $4,000. It jumps to $7,500, then drops to $130, and then it goes down to $3,500. Probably they're on cash accounting. They paid for this month and this, both months here. We want to make sure that's what happened, because it also jumps up to back up to $7,000 here. So what's going on? You want to look through the operating statement and ask questions like this. And here at the end, this is important too. So this is their net operating income. That's all of the operating, but here's their list of capital expenses. So their net operating income was good, but if you add all these capital expenses in, it's negative. They've lost money running this property. And so we have, we got the HVAC replacement. Okay, it's really, really centered in this month, but is that just because that's the summer? It's like, remember, HVAC, it's a big apartment, this is a 126 unit apartment complex. HVAC goes out consistently every year. I mean, how old are the rest of the units? These are things to look into. Like, should you assume that we're going to have a similar amount? That's pretty high, but you assume you have at least a lot every year? Same goes for exterior painting. That's a lot. It probably means you're not going to have to paint it again, but maybe you got to do the roof next year. And then what on earth do they medical disposal? What is that? So lots of questions. Unfortunately, a lot of times you get a statement that looks like this, which is just a complete mess. So this is a property with 20, I think it was 16 duplexes. And so this is a mess. I mean, these are their expenses per year. They don't have it lined up, and it's not either in a complete form like this or on a monthly form. It's just like, here's each property and each item, and you've got to take all this data and like add all of this up. Those are the taxes for it. Put that in your pro forma line item as for taxes, and here's insurance, and here's materials, and you got to take all their data and put it into your pro forma. And it can be messy, but remember, this can be an advantage too, because this will scare off a lot of people. But if you can, now, and it's a little bit more risky, but it will scare off a lot of potential investors. So you take this, you put it into your pro forma, and then you can kind of come to a conclusion. But remember, if you don't have good data from the seller, you got to be a little bit more careful, because it's a higher level of risk. Because you're not as, it's just like if you don't have good comps. If you don't have good accounting, it's a higher level of risk, which is another thing. If you own property, and Phil might talk about this, well, probably not, but if you own property, never skimp on accounting, because that will hurt you in a lot of ways. I mean, it can hurt you in missing fraud or missing opportunities to cut costs. It will also hurt your sales price, because you're going to scare off a lot of buyers. When you're looking at a lease, here are a few things you want to look for. You want to look at the rent, make sure it equals the rent roll. So you're going through each lease. It's very simple if you have one house. It sucks if you have 100 units, because you need to look at them the same way you look at every unit. Make sure the rent is equal to the rent roll. Same, the type, a lot of month to month. It is a year long. Banks will shy away if you have too many month to month leases on a large apartment complex. The deposit, make sure it's equal to the lease. Who pays the utilities? I mean, are you buying, like, if you're buying a house and they rent it out to somebody and all of a sudden you realize you're paying all of that tenant's utilities, that could change things very substantially. Pets, do they have one? Is there a pet rider? Do they pay pet rent? They should pay pet rent. You should always demand pet rent. Philip will talk about that. What's the late fee? When's it applied? Are there any special or weird arrangements? We've seen a lot of ones like with repairs. You never want to let a tenant repair a property. You never want to give them a rent discount to repair a property. But some landlords, especially kind of the mom and pop ones, somehow think it's a good idea. You need to end that if it exists. A couple other things, Section 8 or other voucher, are they getting any government assistance? And then if you are going with commercial properties, you will want to get an estoppel certificate. Now this basically, you send a estoppel certificate to the commercial tenant. This is like, if they're a restaurant or a shop or something like that. This is not generally for standard multifamily residence or something like that. And they fill out like what their terms are as well. Like on the lease, this is what our rent is. This is how long our term is. That way you can make sure that the information that the seller is giving you is right, because it's really, really important. With commercial properties, it's extremely important to get good residents, because you don't have very many of them. Okay, now we're going to move on to the legal due diligence. So legal due diligence, first of all, if you contract, review it before you sign. If you have anything questions about it, make sure to talk to an attorney. One of the big things is permitted work or zoned correctly. If you have a duplex that was a converted house, it probably was not permitted. And that can be a problem when you try to get it refinanced or sold, because oftentimes appraisers won't look at it like it's a house or like a duplex. We have one of these. And you can check with the city, go down and check with the building department to see if it's been zoned correctly.
So say that again now, if you have a duplex.
If it's a house that's been converted into a duplex, like a converted home, if you can tell like it's one of those big houses that you see throughout Hyde Park, they're often converted into duplexes. More often than not, those are not permitted.
So you want to zone it back?
You're not zoning it, it's well, I mean, you can usually they'll just, it's kind of like semi-grandfathered in. It's just, you can rent it off in the postal office. They almost always, the postal office is set up. But it can be a bit tricky with regards to refinancing it and getting it appraised out, to appraise out, or selling it. It can be a little bit tricky in that respect too. So the cash flow can be good. No, yeah, you can reconvert it back to a house, sure. That's expensive though, but it's mostly something you want to check on. And you also, if you check on it and it has, or you could actually get it permitted after the fact, which is just cost, and they're probably going to make you upgrade some things and change some things, and so that's a bit risky. But you can use that as a negotiation if you're buying it. Like, hey, this was never permitted. Maybe need a discount on that. Legal non-conforming, I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Easements or boundaries, usually this is not a problem. Easements are things like, somebody gets an easement so they can, they have a driveway. If, say, there's no way to get to their house other than through your property, or the utility company will get an easement for an electrical pole or something like that. We had one house, actually the one I mentioned earlier, with that little outhouse, small house, which was, looked from the zoning map like it was right on the boundary. Now there's a fence there, and surveys can be fairly expensive, so we decided not to get it. But there might be situations where you want to verify where the easements are or where the boundaries are, and that's when you get a surveyor. If you ever have an HOA, particularly with condos, you're definitely going to want to request the bylaws. Verify it can be rented. We bought condos before that could not be rented because the bylaws said they couldn't. Verify the HOA fee is what you thought it was. Make sure, go through the other rules, make sure they are what you think they are. Make sure they have sufficient working capital. You might not be able to get their balance sheet, but at least ask what it is. You can walk around. There's one property near the plaza, this condo we were looking at buying. Condos are not great investments, but every once in a while they're good. And we saw that, like, okay, there's lots of vacant units, there's tons of work to be done on this property. They're going to charge us a special assessment. And this means if they need money to do work on the property and you're in an HOA, especially if you're in a condo association, they just charge everybody in that association a special assessment. It could be thousands of dollars to do whatever capital improvement to the building is necessary if they don't have the money on hand. So that's something you got to be careful of, because your numbers might look great until they throw that special assessment your way. And then title company. If you're closing a property, unless you're in a state with a lawyer, anyways, either title company or lawyer, you always close with them, and the exceptions to that are absolutely none ever. Always close with a title company. They have title insurance, so any problems with title, if they find a lien from 30 years ago that they missed, they pay for it and you don't. But if you buy a house without title insurance or anything, or without title work, it's got an $80,000 loan on it, that $80,000 loan is yours now. So this is an example of a legal non-conforming unit. This is the one I just mentioned. So this is a nice little house in Shawnee, and this is a complete turd. And so I went online and went to the Johnson County's website to see if I could find anything. The house, they've got information on the house. It's a little 600 square foot house, but it doesn't say anything about whether it was permitted, whether it's allowed to be there. So I called them, and they said, yes, it is legal non-conforming. As long as it's rented, you can stay rented, but if it goes vacant for 12 months, you cannot rent it again. Well, we don't think that's going to be a problem. It's just an extra unit, it's extra income. That makes sense to us. That's what we wanted it to be. But that's the situation you might come across. Okay, inspections. So these are the types of inspections. The big one is property inspection, just a general property inspection. There's some special add-ons, like doing an inspection for lead or asbestos or radon. Lead, they outlawed lead in paint in 1978, but if it's before then, there's a likelihood it has lead paint. It's not the end of the world if it does, but it probably does if it's pre-1978. Termite inspections, we have an example that'll go through in a bit. Sewer line inspections. I always, with any house older than really 40 years, sometimes in cases even 30 years, especially in areas like Grandview where there's terrible soil, we always get a sewer line inspection. We want to see if there's roots piled up throughout this line, or whether there's offsets. And like you basically sewer line inspection, they stick a camera on a hose down this line, and you see that there's major offset in the pipe, or whether there's roots coming through or anything like that, or whether you just have a septic tank, in which case you want to get a septic tank inspection. And in a lot of places, most places throughout Kansas City, you cannot replace a septic tank. If it's shot, you need to tie into the sewer, and they charge you a load fee, which can be very expensive. So if you have a septic tank that's shot, that probably kills the deal. Or you need a major discount. Roof inspections, phase 1, which is an environmental inspection, and you only get it on a large apartment or office building. And then Alta survey, which is if you have a question about boundaries or easements. So should you get an inspection if you're a newbie or just getting started? Yes, always. I'd always get an inspection. Still you get things like this. So here you'll have like minor siding rot noted in the front of the house, paint peeling, north end. So you just little items like this, and it just goes through each major system in the house: the exterior siding, the interior siding, the HVAC, the electrical. You should always get one of those. If you're a seasoned investor, I'd say it depends. If there's ever a large purchase, absolutely. If there's anything you're unsure about, yes. If you're buying in volume, maybe not. We don't usually get inspections on a house we're buying. We've been through a lot of them. We do thorough inspections ourselves, so we usually don't. But inspections, or a couple notes here. One, schedule them early, because you've only got your inspection period. You only got about 15 days for a house, sometimes 10. So schedule them quickly, get on it. Some of them are busy. You may need to follow up, like if you have a property inspector look at something like this, the electrical, this is bad splices, it says you should put in a junction box. You got a lot of issues like this, you might want to have an electrician, a specialist in it, look at it. So you might need to follow up on that property inspection, another reason to schedule early. Be there for the inspection. I highly recommend it, especially the sewer line inspection. Every plumbers and the like, and they usually cost about $200 to get a sewer line inspection. They always, shockingly, lean towards replace it. And a sewer line can cost $3,500 to $5,000, even more if it's under a lot of concrete, like if it's under a driveway or something like that to get to it. So, I mean, if there's just some roots in the line, I mean, whatever, just just snake it out. But some contractors might be like, oh, you need to replace it. And so you want to be there for it, or have somebody you trust be there for it. But inspections are fantastic for retrading, because it's much easier to believe a professional than you. If you say, oh, I think this, the electrical panel is not any good. You're the buyer. Of course you're going to say that. Everything's not good and you want a lower price on everything. But if an inspector says that and you have it in paper, that's a great tool to renegotiate. So we're going to go right to retrading, which is just the real estate way of saying renegotiating. I don't know why I have it. This is a house we bought a couple years ago. And the walkthrough shows signs of termite damage. These mud tunnels you can see here is termites. If you ever see these little mud, these weird little discolorations, these little tunnels that go along the wall, that's termites. This right here is textbook termites. This entire joist is shot. And there was a lot of that throughout the basement. So we found out when we walked through, we had an inspector take a look at it. We had it under contract for $45,000. We asked for a retrade of $3,500. They immediately accepted, so I should have asked for more, but it is what it is. Got it for $41,500. And remember, you must retrade before the inspection period ends. If you're after it, your earnest, you can still try, but you've lost your leverage. Your earnest money is now forfeit. So you want to get on it. You don't wait on your due diligence. And that's the house that, after we finish it, looks really nice. And so the last part is the final decision. And this is, there's two main things. The first one is to ask for let's go back here. Ask for what you want, both when you're trying to buy the property and also when you're retrading. And this is probably the most important thing. These 2 points will make you a better negotiator than probably 90% of the people out there. The second one is always be willing to walk away. Never get attached to a real estate deal. There is a tendency in real estate, like, oh, that's a beautiful house, it's so cute or whatever. It is just an investment. Yes, we want to make nice houses and provide good housing for our residents and all the rest of it, but it is just an investment. No one would get emotionally attached to some GE stock or something like that. So you always need to be willing to walk away. If you lose that ability to walk away, that willingness to do so, you've lost your leverage at the negotiation. And the person who's not willing to walk away is the person who will generally lose that negotiation. What we like to do with any larger purchase is basically play devil's advocate. And you can do this if you have a partner, one person can be the devil's advocate and the other person not, or you can do it with yourself and just make the best case you can not to purchase the property. Like, what is your case not to do it? It's assuming like you've gone through the renegotiating process, you know where they're at, and you don't want to make a habit out of renegotiating. You only do that if you have a legitimate reason to, otherwise you get a reputation. But I mean, certainly do it if there's a legitimate reason to. But if there's a good reason not to purchase the property, there's a tendency for people to want to be consistent. Well, I got under contract, I did all this work, now I have to close it. Make sure that's not just following through on being consistent, because that's the process you start on. Make sure it's still a good deal to you. It's still the deal you want to buy. And if, like this is one this is a 74 unit we got under contract. They told us our occupancy was going to be at 90%, but when we actually got under contract and looked at it, it was at 71%. And then we saw we had some Federal Pacific panels, which were all useless. And then we had mold noted in the ceiling in many units, but they didn't even know where it was coming from. And then we had these patio doors where you can see, like, whenever it's like this, that means there's moisture between the panes and they're completely shot. You got to replace them. And then we had visible damage from wood-destroying insects noted in the following units, all these units. And then my estimated rehab budget went from 100 to 375, and I think I was still undershooting it. So this one, we started the process of considering renegotiating, and we're like, just no, it's not any good. We walked away. So you got to be willing to walk away, and that one would have been a disaster. One bad deal can prevent you from doing the next 3 good ones, the next 5 good ones. So you got to be cognizant of that. So, but if the due diligence goes well, close. Buy the property. Being a real estate investor is about buying real estate. So this is not all doom and gloom and finding reasons and excuses not to do something. If it all, you're going through this process, and if it all works out, buy it. And don't worry about being perfect. There's a lot in due diligence. There's so many items here, and we could go even deeper into this if we had more time. But it's, you're never going to be perfect at anything, and you're not going to be perfect at due diligence. The most important is follow your checklist, be very thorough, be very careful. And if you get most of it, you will, well, first of all, do a lot better than most people, and you will almost certainly be okay. And sometimes it's the deals you don't do that make you rich. And so that's kind of the last thing last thought I would give you. It's not what, I don't think the rich dad, poor dad people are going to be talking about that. But yeah, it's about, especially as I mentioned on Tuesday, we are probably sometime in the next year or two going into recession. It's all the more important now to be buying right. It doesn't mean to stop. I would never recommend just stop buying, because predicting the market is a fool's errand. It could go another 2-3 years, who knows? But it does mean be more careful. Make sure you're getting that equity when you buy it. And this is all the more important. With that, I will open up the floor to any questions, and then go ahead.
How does this process differ when you're buying through a wholesaler? So the inspection period, I think I've had some say no inspection as is.
It's much faster. Wholesalers almost always want it done in 10 days or thereabout. And so whenever I'm working with a wholesaler, I want to get out to the property almost immediately. And I want to take a look at it. Now, again, I don't generally do inspections on this, and you might have to, that might be a situation where you can't really do it, even if a new investor, which just means you have to be more, that's another contingency to add. There's an example. We bought a large portfolio of properties a couple of years ago. And one of the big things, this guy did not want us to go through every single house, because it was just, there's too many of them. It's a big hassle. And so we only got to see a scattering of them. And I said earlier, always walk every unit. Well, this one we couldn't. So at one point I just picked random ones. I want to see this one, this one, this one, this one, this one. But that just means you got to add a bigger contingency. So if the wholesaler's like, you can't do inspections, there's no because we got to close this in 7 days, because every wholesaler wants to close in 7 days. That's usually going to add a bigger contingency to that. But I always at least want to view the property myself. I've never closed a property, other than that one portfolio. I've seen every unit we've closed. And so at the very least do that. And if you can't get some of those, the more inspections, the more things you can't get because of what the seller wants, that means the more contingency you need to add, and probably the more conservative you need to be in your offer.
Yeah. Do you have, because this is kind of a several line type of answer. Do you have a resource for like what dollar amount or ranges that you adjust, going back to CMAs, okay? That you adjust for some of the different things, like for square footage, for bathrooms, different bedrooms, age, condition, or is there a resource?
It's kind of, that's a tough one. It's the problem is it depends on the area. Like if you're in Mission Hills, and the properties range from $1 to $6 million, that's going to be a lot different than if you're in if you're in the Waldo and they range from $80,000 to $250,000. Generally, I'd say there's no great resource, but the best way to probably see it is to expand your comps a little bit and see what the differences are there. So like, what does it look like a similar house is selling between a 3-1 and a 2-1? And so it's like, well, okay, that's probably about a $5,000-ish difference. Then that can be your approximate adjustment. You can also ask, you could actually ask appraisers, like what kind of adjustment would you make for this? And again, the main thing is you want to pick comps that are already really close. So if you don't want to pick a comp that already needs a lot of work and compare that to a comp compare that to your after repair value property, that comp you want to leave to the side. You want to find a comp that's very, very similar already, so you don't have to make a lot of adjustments. But it kind of depends on the particular market you're in, and the best way I would say is to look at, usually they're not major adjustments. I probably, for like on that example there, I think for it was like 70, 80 square feet. I added $5,000, and that's kind of looking at the other houses around it, and seeing how much they went up and how much they went down, and of course I kind of double check that by just comparing it to the square footage for any of the really similar comps. So I sorry there's not a great answer to that question, but I have just called up appraisers that have done properties for them and asked them questions like that before. So that's another option you can do.
Going back to ungrounded houses that do not have ground you test for, the 3-pronged flood.
Yeah.
Why did you bring that up, and what's basically the net effective result of that?
Well, there are a couple results. The first one is Section 8 have a problem with ungrounded?
Yeah, Section 8, you have to have grounding.
So Section 8 would be off limits for that. The other thing is is a general issue with the house that makes it less desirable for sale and also for refinance. It's more dangerous. GFCIs don't work with ungrounded outlets, so you already have a more dangerous bathroom and kitchen. It's sort of just like a permanent, it's not permanent, but a semi-permanent dysfunction this house has. There's other thing like older properties that have plaster and lath instead of drywall. That is always trickier to patch and not as good overall. And it's just kind of the issue with the house that's there, because rewiring a house is extremely challenging. The one thing I didn't mention was knob and tube wiring. If you see that in a basement, that's a big fire hazard, and you should just replace that. But with regards to ungrounded, it's really probably not worth it.
I just have one update. We don't do this, so I'm not 100% certain, but I believe if you have 2-prong outlets, Section 8 will allow to pass an inspection if all your outlets are 2-prong and not grounded, I believe. But residents don't like 2-prong outlets because you can't plug anything into them. So it's kind of, one way or the other, you kind of have an issue there. So I'm not 100% certain on that, but I believe that's one way to get a Section 8 inspection passed.
Yeah, I would just say mostly it makes your property less desirable, or unless you're actually going to go ahead and replace it, and that makes it very, very, very expensive to do.
I can confirm what Philip was saying, because I had that in one of my rental properties. Had a 3-prong outlet, but it wasn't grounded, so they just never put a 2-prong outlet into that.
But then your tenants don't like it. Yeah.
That kind of raises a question of complying with current code, and at what point do your renovations fall into that?
Well, pretty much. I mean, if you're changing the property structurally in any way, if you're let's say adding a new part of the building or converting a garage or something like that, that all needs to be upgraded. If the property were to burn and you need to replace part of it, that's all needs to be upgraded. But if it's just like the code change, the property was built in 1950 and the code changed in 1970, it's grandfathered in. So you don't need to change it as it is until you make a major structural adjustment to it. And that wouldn't include painting it. That doesn't include changing the carpet. That doesn't include, light fixtures or anything that's sort of aesthetic to it. It really has to do with structural changes. It wouldn't even change, like if you added a closet, that's not going to change it. But if you're moving walls around, then okay, now you're moving. If you're basically going to a place where you need to permit something, that's when they start demanding you start upgrading things.
Yeah, so a specific question about the GFCI on ungrounded houses. So how much would it cost to simply add what's needed for GFCIs in like kitchen and bathroom?
Basically, grounding a GFCI in the bathroom. It just depends on how easy it is to get access to the basement. I mean, it could be fairly easy. You can just run the ground wire up, and then tie the ground wire off to some pipe going down or something like that. It really depends on how much access you have to. We have done that once or twice, I think. But it just depends. Like if it's in a crawl space, it could be very difficult. If it's a slab, it could be almost impossible. If it's an open basement, it could be fairly on a 1 story. It could be fairly simple. If it's 2 or 3 stories, it could be very difficult. So it depends.
So it sounds like you haven't done that.
We have done that a couple times, but usually not, because usually it's like in a crawl space or it's a 2-story or something like that.
Is there any liability on you as a housing provider that you'd like to add GFCI, or like for you, what's the reason?
Well, I mean, making the property safer is always a good thing. But if you get insurance on a property, it will cover it as it is, unless you do something. Unless, a lot of these properties, there are a lot of old properties in Kansas City. There are a lot of old properties that don't have, that aren't grounded. If you have them, you should always insure your properties, and you should always, get sufficient liability insurance in case something like that happens, and that should cover you.
I have a little to add to that. I mean, there are some properties that don't have outlets and bathrooms or things like that, and that just is a terrible way to live in a bathroom these days. Everybody needs electricity for all sorts of things, shavers or hair curlers or whatever. So just making it more livable, passing Section 8 inspections, you can't have an outlet next to the water. I mean, you don't want to have an outlet next to the water anyways. So just for livability reasons, increasing rent, basically making residents like the house so they want to stay is a big reason to just make it livable. I mean, sometimes it's not worth the cost, but generally we try to make sure they have some access to electricity in the bathroom.
Any other questions?
I'm curious, I realize you're filming the event here. I was curious if there's any way that tapes would be available for sale or for...
I mean, if you want to buy them, I'd be happy to sell them to you. But we're just gonna post them on YouTube. We're just gonna post them on YouTube sometime in the next.
Yeah, at the end of my presentation, I'll kind of show you where to, at least to find the one of what I'm doing, and I'm sure we'll lead you to where Andy's is.
But again,
it's hard to take the notes stuff, make it, off,
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I speak fast. I've had problems with I've had some people who like to speak at a more normal pace, and but anyways, they will be on YouTube probably in the next month or so. I don't know.
I don't know when exactly, but I'll show you guys how to figure out when they're going to be available.
Right, not complaining. I mean, I like the fast pace, this, that, and the other. It's just hard to take notes and comprehend it all.
No, I understand.
So if I could cross-reference it, it would help,
Yeah, absolutely. No, I appreciate
I think there's probably some others there that feel the same way.
Am I speaking too fast? It's too late now. I can't go back. You watch it at 0.75 speed. Yeah. Well, it's about 10:45 almost. It's probably a good time. We take a little break and start at 11.
15 minutes, yeah. Probably gather back at 11. That's probably about when I'll get started talking about property management stuff.
Yeah, so we're switch up from due diligence to property management. Weird mix, but it's what we're interested in right now. All right.
Thanks, guys.